The night of January 5, 1943, hung heavy over the Solomon Islands. Clouds pressed low, and the surface of the sea barely reflected starlight. USS Helena steamed dark, her wake faint and almost invisible, every light masked under black canvas. The crew already knew the sound in the distance. Engines carried across water with a rhythm men recognized long before shapes ever appeared. Lieutenant William "Red" Cochran stood at his mount, headset clamped tight, jaw locked in silence. His section had trained for this moment in endless drills, and now the real test arrived. Around him the gun crew shifted into position like a machine drilled too often to misfire. The pointer had hands on traverse wheels, the trainer leaned into elevation, the talker repeated ranges from radar with a flat tone, and the loaders kept the ready box open. A crude chalk +2 mark still scratched across the side of the fuse crate. None of the men asked about it. None of them needed to. The klaxon had long since died away, but the tension it left clung to every bulkhead. Sound-powered phones carried clipped voices across the ship. Air contact inbound, multiple, fast. The message reached every battle station in the same dry cadence. They had heard it before, but never with this particular crate of ammunition waiting under their feet. Radar painted converging lines across its green scope. The talker repeated numbers, his tone unchanged, steady as a metronome. Range closing, range closing. No one looked up. No searchlight stabbed the night. No flares burned over water. Only instruments marked the invisible threat now closing in. The first noise reached them as a vibration under steel. A second later, the sound cut across the deck. Engines at high throttle, still distant but distinct. Then came the shrill, mechanical wail. Japanese Valdive bombers had activated their sirens, a weapon designed to bleed into nerves before iron ever touched hull. Cochran felt the crew tighten, but no one looked away from his task. "Stand ready." His voice carried flat through the headset. Breach closed, shell hoisted, traverse fixed on the sector director called out. The first round fired. Flame cut the night for an instant, recoil hammered back, and the burst flared high and useless, far behind the target. Empty air lit up, then went dark again. Nothing else changed. No man spoke. Loader bent into the crate again. Pointer steadied the wheels. Cochran gave only one word. Again. The second shell lifted. Breech slammed shut, and the mount fired once more. This time the burst erupted beside the cockpit, scattering fragments across the wing. On the radar scope, the echo suddenly distorted. The valve lurched, lost angle, and broke apart in descent. Radar log. Track match confirmed. Bursts. For a second, men breathed too loud into headsets. Then they forced it back down. The cycle had to continue. Another bomber rolled in. Travers shifted on command. Elevation held. Loader slammed another round into the chamber. Fire. Flash. This time the burst detonated square at the noseline. The aircraft folded in the air and fell before release. Bridge did not comment. Commander Parsons stood, pen in hand, but said nothing into the net. Decks below braced for impact, but no bomb struck. The gunnery cycle kept moving. Fire, recoil, reload, traverse, fire again. Noise layered over noise, engines screaming, guns hammering, brass clattering across deck plates. To starboard, the left battery fired with standard time fuses. Their bursts lit the sky wide and harmless. Bright flashes in empty air, no wreckage, no splashes. Their crews worked just as hard, but the results never came. In Cochran's section, the difference showed in minutes. His mount logged immediate hits. Towers counted falling aircraft against expenditure. The contrast needed no explanation. Casings rolled across the deck, kicked clear of ladders by boots already slick with cordite. Smoke clung low, making visibility poor. Loader coughed once, then bent back to his hoist. Water teams drenched barrels to keep steel cool enough to continue. Commands came short. On. Ready. Fire. The rhythm locked into men's muscles until words no longer mattered. One dive bomber pulled away. tried to climb above the effective belt. Cochrane did not chase with elevation. He kept traverse steady, timed the burst on the approach gate, and let the fuse answer. The shell exploded forward of the canopy, tearing the tail clean off. The airframe tumbled into the sea without ever releasing its bomb. Another bomber tried to close from shallower angle, fire again, burst cut across fuselage, nose dipped, wings sheared, dive disintegrated. The mount never paused, shell in, shell out, cadence unbroken. Below decks, machinists felt each recoil as punctuation in the steel frame, but they logged no problems. Their lives hung on what happened above. The enemy pressed harder, filling the corridor with engines and sirens. A bomb struck water short off the starboard bow, spray hammering across deck plates. The tremor underfoot was sharp, different from recoil. Men recognized it instantly, braced harder, and continued cycle. No one left position, no one asked questions. Cochrane counted beats silently, matching range reports with internal timing. He did not fire on panic, he fired on rhythm. His crew followed without doubt. They had no need to know why he waited half a second longer. They trusted the order when it came. By the middle of the attack, the tower's count showed a blunt fact. Left battery, no kills. Cochrane's section, 4 confirmed. The difference was absolute. One side spent steel without effect. The other cut bombers before they could release. Waste against effect. Doctrine against field adjustment. When the last engine retreated into dark, Cochrane gave the ceasefire. Guns safed, breaches checked, muzzles cleared. Smoke drifted over deck. Men slumped where they stood, hands black with grease, faces streaked with sweat. Some lit cigarettes with shaking fingers. Others simply sat against the shield until ordered away. Cochrane removed his headset, set it on the ready box, and looked once more at the smeared chalk +2. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. The mark had already proved itself. One change. Many consequences. The night raid ended, but Cochrane did not leave his station. His crew slumped in place, still clutching empty shells and wiping grime with oily rags. The acrid smell of cordite clung to every surface. The chalk line on the crate still stood visible in the dim light. +2. To Cochrane, it no longer looked like guesswork. It looked like proof. He knew little of the men who had built what sat inside the brass casing. He had never heard the name Merle Tuve spoken on his ship. He did not know the phrase Office of Scientific Research and Development. Yet his own hands worked the direct product of that office's secrecy. In 1940, Britain passed an idea westward, a concept more desperate than polished. British scientists had sketched a radio fuse, but their industry lacked the means to make it real. Germany bombed nightly, and they could not wait. America took the sketch, classified it immediately, and assigned Tuve at the Carnegie Institution to lead the effort. The problem sounded absurd when said aloud. How do you fit a working radio into 6 inches of steel? How do you launch it with 20,000 G of acceleration and not shatter it instantly? How do you make it trigger at the right moment in rain, fog, heat, or cold? Each requirement looked impossible. Early attempts broke apart before the round even left the muzzle. Glass shattered, tubes failed, batteries cracked. A single report from 1941 stated only, "Miniature tube survived drop test." The phrasing was plain, but the meaning was profound. If a tiny vacuum tube could endure a fall, perhaps it could also endure launch from a naval gun. By late 1941, Tuve's team had a working prototype. It did one simple thing. It emitted a radio pulse. If the pulse bounced back from an object nearby, the returning signal altered the circuit and forced detonation. No more guessing where the aircraft would be. The shell would explode when it was close enough. This principle did not need accuracy in seconds. It did not need guesswork about altitude. It only needed proximity. For sailors like Cochrane, it meant that survival had moved from chance to a calculable probability. Trials began in controlled settings. Chesapeake Bay, August 1942. USS Cleveland fired test rounds fitted with the new fuse at target drones towed by aircraft. The observers expected failure, yet watched shells detonate within yards of moving wings. Feathers from seagulls struck incidentally drifted down like snow, an accidental proof of proximity. Logs entered one sentence. Average hits per burst increased. For ordnance officers, that note meant years of research had crossed the line into operational fact. For sailors, it meant that crates arriving at piers could contain the difference between empty bursts and falling aircraft. Production began under guard in New Jersey. Workers, many of them women, soldered wires thin as hair under magnifying lamps. Each shift ended with armed escorts collecting finished tubes. At first, only half worked. Later, 7 of 10 survived testing. By the winter of 1942, 9 of 10 met standards. An ordnance summary phrased it with precision: waste reduced by 70%. That figure mattered. For every 1,000 shells fired, 700 no longer failed outright. 700 more now functioned, and each one could mean a bomber destroyed or a ship saved. Waste down 70% meant effect up by an immeasurable margin. But secrecy governed every step. Europe was off limits. Orders from Washington read, "No deployment in the European theater." The fear was absolute. If one dud fell into German hands, if their scientists reversed the miniature radio tube, years of advantage would vanish. The Axis already strained to match Allied radar. They could not be allowed this second edge. Therefore, only the Pacific would see combat use. Directives were explicit. Recover all duds, divers to retrieve immediately. Men swam dark water at night to collect unexploded rounds. Ships sent boats to recover fragments after raids. Even in victory, secrecy carried risk. Cochrane did not know this when he looked at his crate. He only saw that the chalk mark, the slight adjustment, had turned waste into effect. Yet in that chalk line was a chain linking him to Tuve's laboratory, to British desperation, to soldering irons under guard, and to scientists who argued over circuits until dawn. The mount he commanded became the end point of a long, invisible assembly line. Factory floors produced parts under watch, trains carried them in sealed cars, depots logged them under code names, and finally a crate arrived on a deck in the South Pacific. The chalk +2 was the only sign to the sailor that inside this ordinary brass lay a device as secret as any weapon in the war. In the crew's eyes, nothing about the shell looked different. Brass gleamed the same, weight felt the same. Only when fired did the difference appear. Bursts detonated not behind tails or high above fuselages, but near wings, near cockpits, near fuel tanks. Explosions happened where they could matter. Cochrane once glanced at a briefing sheet delivered to his division. The language had been terse. VT fuse authorized for limited operational use. Handle under strict precautions. No photographs, no technical details, only instructions. Keep separate from standard stocks, return unused rounds, log every expenditure. The words meant little on paper. They meant survival when night came. Every dud demanded recovery. Men cursed when divers had to enter water slick with fuel, but the order allowed no exceptions. Fragments carried back to the ship went straight into sealed boxes. Sailors never asked why. They had been told the reason was simple. If one fell into enemy hands, the secret would not survive. Cochrane thought little about laboratories or engineers. His mind stayed on mounts and bearings, on the sound of engines and the count of shells. But the chalk mark told him one thing with certainty. Somebody, somewhere, had built something that worked where nothing had worked before. One shell. Endless labor. The raid pressed harder as minutes passed. What had begun with a single dive bomber now grew into a formation determined to break through the screen. Engines thundered over the water, louder with every second. Sirens wailed, a steady sound meant to cut into nerves. But Cochrane's mount did not pause. His men worked as though the sirens were background noise, not weapons. Shells came up from the hoist, one after another. Breech slammed shut, recoil hammered back, brass rolled underfoot. The cycle continued without hesitation. Loader wiped sweat from his face with a sleeve blackened from grease. Pointer kept eyes fixed forward, correcting traverse by fractions of degrees. Trainer breathed in rhythm with elevation orders. Cochrane said little. His job was not to inspire, but to measure time, distance, and the moment to fire. The formation split across the horizon. Some aircraft pressed in steep dives. Others tried shallow approaches, hoping to evade the belt. Cochrane made no distinction. He fired on the target his director assigned, trusting the fuse to decide the precise moment of detonation. The first shell from this sequence burst ahead of a bomber's nose. Fragments shredded the propeller, and the plane spun into the sea. Tower tally reported without inflection. 4 confirmed to starboard section. The words carried no tone, no celebration, only count. To sailors trained on endless drills, those 4 meant a difference between survival and disaster. On the opposite side, the left battery still fired time fuses. Their bursts exploded in regular sequences exactly where doctrine prescribed. Yet the sky where their shells detonated remained empty. No enemy aircraft intersected their boxes of fire. Their log recorded expenditure only, no kills. Here the contrast became clear. One battery spent shells according to manual and saw nothing fall. Cochrane's section, using the adjusted fuses, produced results within minutes. 4 confirmed. Waste versus effect. Doctrine against practice. Smoke thickened over the deck, making every breath feel heavier. The crew kept hands moving even as vision blurred. One man spat black residue to the deck, then went back to his lever. Brass rolled and clattered, water hissed as it cooled barrels, and every voice on the line remained clipped and flat. Another dive bomber pitched downward, bomb still under wing. Cochrane timed his order. The burst detonated beside the cockpit, fragments cutting straight into the fuselage. The plane disintegrated in mid-air, scattering wreckage that splashed in multiple points around the ship. None of the fragments struck friendly steel, but the danger was obvious. Even success carried risks when bursts happened this close. A shallow approach tried to slip beneath the arc of fire. Cochrane adjusted traverse by half a degree and ordered fire. The shell burst low, fragments cutting across tail structure. The aircraft struck the sea short of the ship, bomb detonating harmlessly in water. Crew noted the kill but said nothing more. Minutes stacked into a rhythm that felt endless. Fire, recoil, brass, smoke, reload, fire again. Talker repeated bearings in the same voice, no matter if the number changed by yards or miles. It was the tone that kept the mount steady, not the figures. Tower repeated another report, total 6 confirmed. The number carried weight far beyond its syllables. It meant 6 aircraft that never released bombs, 6 holes that did not rip through decks, 6 splashes that replaced what could have been fire on steel. The left battery continued without results. Their bursts illuminated night sky with flashes that fell empty. Men there sweated just as much, shouted commands just as loud, but recorded no kills. Doctrine had promised them protection. The enemy did not respect doctrine. On Cochrane's side, the visual math became undeniable. One section with adjusted fuses produced confirmed results, another with standard fuses produced none. The contrast was sharp enough that even those below decks, listening to radio calls, began to sense the difference. Numbers told the story before words ever did. Enemy aircraft continued pressing. A bomb detonated close off the port quarter, shaking bulkheads but leaving hull intact. The vibration rattled teeth, but mounts stayed on target. No one left position. Orders remained clipped. Fire, reload, traverse. A burst detonated directly inside a formation, fragments scattering across 2 aircraft at once. One fell immediately, wings folding. The second limped away, trailing fuel, before vanishing behind cloud. The mount crew saw only the glow of impact on the horizon. Cochrane gave no acknowledgment beyond a nod. He raised 2 fingers to the loader, then pointed forward. The cycle continued. His men did not need speeches. They needed rhythm. Another tower note entered the log. 8 confirmed total starboard section. The language never changed, only the numbers. Those numbers now outpaced anything the battery had recorded in months. By now, ammunition runners hauled crates faster. Ready boxes emptied, then filled again. Sweat dripped into eyes, stinging, but no man let go of his task. They understood that each shell mattered. Waste could mean death, effect could mean survival. Brass piled at ankles, threatening to trip men at their wheels. Boatswain shoved debris aside with his boot. A runner nearly fell on a casing but steadied himself and kept going. Discipline kept chaos from breaking the mount's cycle. Enemy aircraft wavered. Some pressed harder, diving desperate, while others pulled away, unwilling to face the belt again. The disruption itself was victory. Cohesion gone, timing ruined, bombs fell wide, or not at all. In less than an hour, the record had shifted. Instead of thousands of rounds for one plane destroyed, Cochrane's section logged multiple kills with measured expenditure. Waste dropped. Effect multiplied. The difference was not marginal. It was exponential. Smoke cleared slightly as wind shifted. Crew breathed easier, but fatigue dragged arms and legs. Pointer's knuckles bled where steel had torn skin. Loader's sleeve was soaked through with sweat and water from cooling barrels. No one asked to stop. Cochrane kept eyes forward, voice level. He knew they had crossed from theory to fact. The chalk mark had been guesswork. Now it was record. The tower's count stood as proof, and the contrast between batteries confirmed it beyond argument. When the last echo faded from radar and silence returned over water, the order finally came. Cease firing. Breaches opened, chambers cleared, barrels cooled one final time. Men leaned against shields, lungs heaving, uniforms blackened. Cochrane removed his headset, wiped sweat with the back of his hand, and looked once more at the crate. The chalk +2 line was smeared now, almost erased by contact, but he did not redraw it. It no longer needed to be seen. The tower's tally already carried the truth. 1 mark. Last line of defense. When silence returned after the raid, Cochrane's section stood among piles of brass and barrels still steaming from water buckets. The crew had logged numbers that broke every prior record. 4 aircraft in the first minutes, then more, until the tower's count stood at 8 confirmed. For the men at the mount, it felt like vindication, but for staff officers, it raised questions. Reports moved upward quickly. By dawn, the gunnery officer compiled a sheet of expenditure versus kills. The ratio stood beyond anything the ship had ever recorded. Ammunition that once scattered in vain now delivered results at fractions of the cost. One battery had wasted shells without effect. Another had cut through aircraft with measurable precision. The comparison was stark enough that no explanation other than the fuse would fit. Enemy pilots noticed as well. Intelligence summaries taken later confirmed that Japanese formations altered altitude in subsequent raids. Instead of diving through the same corridor, they approached 1,000 feet higher, hoping to escape the adjusted bursts. Pilots shortened their runs, dropped earlier, and sought angles that reduced time exposed to fire. Tactical notes written that week carried the phrase, "Enemy altitude increased plus 1,000 feet on repeat sortie." For Cochrane's crew, the adjustment meant constant recalibration. What had worked at one height required new timing the next night. The chalk mark on the crate had served as guidance, but it could not remain static. Each change in enemy profile meant new guesswork. Success came not from doctrine, but from men willing to shift settings in the middle of combat. On the bridge, officers argued how to classify what had just occurred. The commanding officer logged a terse entry. Unauthorized adjustment reported. Further use requires confirmation. His tone was neither praise nor condemnation, only procedure. Staff in Washington demanded that any field innovation be verified before distribution. To them, survival of one ship mattered less than protection of a classified device. Cochrane felt the debate only as delay. His section had already seen the result. Yet the bureaucracy moved at its own pace. Orders arrived that Europe remained off-limits for the new fuse. The fear persisted. If even a fragment reached German hands, the miniature radio tube inside might be reverse-engineered. To protect the secret, whole theaters of war were denied its use. The Pacific became the test ground by necessity. Crews there bore the risks and also the burden of recovery. Every dud demanded retrieval. Divers entered dark water after raids, guided only by faint phosphorescence and orders not to fail. Fragments were collected, catalogued, and sealed. Reports described recovery as routine, but sailors knew it carried its own dangers. Cochrane's men saw little of those policies. They only knew that each round fired was logged separately, that expended cases were counted, and that deviations had to be explained. What had begun as chalk marks in the middle of battle now required justification on paper. Innovation had moved from deck plates to filing cabinets. Arguments reached higher levels. Some officers considered the adjustment reckless, risking safety margins that manuals demanded. Others called it proof that sailors in combat could refine doctrine faster than laboratories. Both sides wrote memoranda, and the result was predictable. Further trials ordered, no changes authorized until additional data confirmed effect. The contrast between battlefield urgency and staff procedure widened. Men on the line needed answers in seconds. Men in offices asked for statistics collected over weeks. Each side saw the other as blind. Cochrane's crew only knew that the next raid would come whether approval did or not. By the second week of January, changes in Japanese attack profiles became consistent. Altitude higher, angles sharper, bombs released earlier. The adaptation showed that the enemy had noticed the new fuse's effect. They did not know what technology caused it, but they sensed that something invisible had shifted odds against them. Their answer was altitude. The staff's answer was paper. Directives repeated the same phrase: provide log, radar, and camera evidence before change in standard procedure. For Cochrane, that meant his experience became a statistic filed into reports he would never read. One visual calculation circulated among gunnery officers. 1,000 feet added to enemy altitude meant nearly 2 seconds less for defenders to adjust fire. 2 seconds could decide if fragments met wing or empty sky. For sailors, that was the math that mattered. Cochrane continued to command his section through raids, adjusting settings when necessary, accepting risk quietly. The bureaucracy remained cautious, the enemy remained adaptive, and the crew remained caught between. Enemy altitude increased. Directives tightened ahead of spring operations. By mid-1943, what had started on Helena moved outward. Reports folded into distribution lists. Crates arrived with seals and warnings. Training briefs added new pages that did not exist a year before. Men on other decks began repeating small habits Cochrane had drilled: steady traverse, cross-checks after each burst, film for later review. The chalk mark that once lived on a single crate turned into a printed line on a card. Production scaled in ways sailors could feel without seeing the factories. More boxes reached piers on schedules that shortened by weeks. Ordnance officers spoke about batches and lots instead of scrounging. Gun crews noticed the difference as absence, a night without the old shortages, a watch without the quiet argument over which section would get the last few rounds. Orders changed cautiously. A theater bulletin permitted broader use under supervision and reiterated the same restrictions that had followed the fuse from its first tests. No duds left afloat, no transfer to Europe, no talk outside the net. Divers briefed for post-raid sweeps as routinely as for gunnery. What looked like heroics the first time became maintenance. Through 1944, logs from carrier screens and convoy escorts began to show a pattern that did not depend on a single ship or lucky night. Ammunition expended per aircraft destroyed fell across sectors. Planners who trusted columns more than adjectives adopted a new metric as second nature. The shift played out in the rhythm of watches, fewer long sequences of empty flashes, more short engagements that ended before nerves frayed. Then the enemy changed the question. Kamikaze tactics appeared not as rumor, but as a set of approach profiles and speeds. Aircraft came to collide, not to drop. It forced belts to move farther outward and bursts to cut earlier along the corridor. Directors emphasized approach gates. Mounts rehearsed handoffs, so overlaps did not leave gaps. What counted now was whether impact occurred inside the screen or died in the lane before it. Ships learned to treat the belt like a single breathing thing. Disrupt early, destroy in the corridor, deny the inner screen. After-action digests from multiple task groups describe the same cause and effect in restrained language. Watch officers stopped talking about luck in debriefs and started talking about timing, because timing could be taught, repeated, and checked. Across the ocean, a different target forced the same logic. In summer 1944, the V-1 flying bomb campaign pushed British defenses hard. Early belts caught too few to matter in public morale. When radar direction paired consistently with proximity detonation, the phrasing in official summaries shifted from exceptions to norms. Interception rose from a minority to a clear majority. The sentence meant fewer roofs opened at night and fewer fires spread along streets already tired of flames. Factories kept pace with the demand their own success created. Yield improved, and the variance between lots narrowed. Ordnance men began to speak in the calm way people do when a thing that once surprised them now behaves as predicted. What had been a fragile invention on paper settled into the rough life of service, stacked on steel, hauled in rain, loaded by hands that judged quality by whether a night ended in silence or in splashes. Pressure on commanders grew in proportion to confidence. If a device could burst near fast metal in air, could a similar logic help field guns over ground? Trials moved cautiously from rumor to entry in a schedule. A handful of artillery units fitted variable time mechanisms adapted for their shells. The test was small in count and large in effect. Bursts set just above advancing infantry produced fragmentation patterns denser and more uniform than earlier methods. Tactical officers wrote about assaults failing quickly. Supply officers wrote about ammunition lasting longer. The language around those trials changed tone as winter approached. In the Ardennes, close-quarter fighting and weather made every hour heavy. Units that used the adapted fuses logged immediate disruption of enemy concentrations. Columns paused, attacks broke apart in snow and hedgerow. Operational researchers recorded gains in area coverage per shell and reductions in time to stop an advance at key points. The numbers did not wait for opinion, but the same documents carried a different weight in their margins. Medical officers described wounds that felt different in pattern and count. Chaplains wrote about unease among crews who had asked for clear rules before employment. Legal officers drafted thresholds and distances that could live in orders instead of in rumor. The debate moved from mess tables to staff rooms because the consequences reached beyond a single ridge or morning. One line captured the compromise as it formed and then hardened into a paragraph of policy. Deployments of VT-adapted artillery require explicit ROE and safety margins. Staff note. It did not end the discussion. It made the discussion governable. Commanders could request, lawyers could approve, logisticians could supply, and inspectors could check meteorology and proximity to friendlies before a fuse key turned. Cochrane heard about the ground trials in fragments while rotating through training detachments at fleet bases. He listened without arguing. His work remained over water and under a sky that taught him the cost of minutes and the price of a single aircraft slipping through a belt. He kept his instruction where his hands knew the weight of the thing, mounts, ready boxes, and talkers, who learned to say ranges in a level voice. Kamikaze raids demanded more of the same discipline, men trained to hold traverse steady when wakes yawed and to take ranges from the man who had them, not from the man who wanted them. Crews learned to treat radar film and camera strips as tools, not trophies. The briefing after a long day compared frames to notations until a mistake looked like a bent nail. Then the bent nail was hammered flat before the next night rather than during it. Reports from convoy routes and picket stations made a point without trying to be eloquent. Fewer impacts on hulls, more kills in the lane. When numbers failed to move public talk, the absence of damage told the story at piers and in yards. Ships returned scorched, patched, and ready rather than holed beyond hope. The change lived in the number of men who lined up for mail call instead of in the number of names read at muster. Europe's winter debate did not end with the Ardennes. It settled into policy that allowed use under strict conditions and forbade it elsewhere. Requests moved with attached weather data, approvals carried signatures from legal and ordnance branches. After-action packets included the same cross-checks Cochrane had taught at sea. The ground learned from the water without admitting it in words. For sailors, the ethical argument reached them as a reminder to check bearings and wind before they checked conscience. The belt still had to work, or everything behind it became academic. Cochrane kept the vocabulary narrow: range, rate, bearing, confirm, because narrow words fit inside noise and stress. He found that men who knew what to do with small words did not freeze when big ones arrived. On lines of approach, the technology made nonsense of some old habits and replaced them with others that looked obvious once men had practiced them 2 or 3 times. Mounts staggered bursts, so boxes overlapped without waste. Sections handed targets like pieces of rope rather than like hot stones. Directors stopped chasing and started predicting, because prediction shortened work. The visual math of the belt settled into one line crews could repeat without numbers. Rounds per kill collapsed against the old baseline. It was not a ratio to brag about. It was a habit to be maintained. If a night crept back toward waste, men dug for the reason: a cable, a calibration, a human hand moving too fast because it wanted to finish early. Across the Atlantic, V-1 defense matured into doctrine in the same quiet way. What had looked miraculous in first weeks became routine with practice. The phrase "clear majority intercepted" replaced the earlier stutter of percentages in public talk. In private, officers kept the graphs because graphs argue calmly when days run long. The cost of secrecy did not disappear. Crews still pulled duds from water when they could find them, and supply lines kept batches separated to reduce confusion in field reports. Intelligence summaries flagged any rumor of capture and demanded confirmation by several channels before decisions changed. The same caution that had once kept the fuse off European fronts now managed its use across them. Cochrane visited ships that had been in service long enough to show both competence and fatigue. Paint scorched around mounts. Deck fittings rattled in a way only men who lived with them could hear. He watched a new pointer breathe through his nose and keep hands even on a patch of sea that made sliders feel sticky. He corrected posture and tone before he corrected timing, because a voice carries farther under stress than a number does. Some nights the belt worked so cleanly that the only evidence of a raid was the smell of cordite and a line in a log. Other nights, a single aircraft slipped too far in and left a scar that would live on a hull until war ended, or the ship did. The weapon changed odds, not fate. Sailors understood odds better than most. When reports circled back from the Ardennes in their final approved forms, the paragraphs read like the sea had written them: checklists, distances, verbs that commanded rather than described. The ground had adopted the same discipline because discipline travels better than adjectives. What could be taught could be repeated. What could be repeated could be trusted. Cochrane kept his own counsel about the ethics others argued. He taught what he could measure: a belt, time to approach, a burst placed near metal, a crew that spoke in words that fit through wire. He trusted the system that forced 3 confirmations before doctrine changed: radar, tally, film, because that system had rescued knights from rumor. One capability, many hard decisions. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War reached its final scale. Okinawa turned into the largest operation of the campaign, and with it came the most sustained air assault of the conflict. Kamikaze aircraft did not arrive in small groups, but in waves counted by the hundred. Crews aboard American ships stood at stations for hours, knowing that one mistake in timing meant fire across decks and men lost below. Cochrane was not there. USS Helena had already been sunk by torpedoes near Kula Gulf in July 1943. Survivors remembered water boiling with oil and steel, folding in seconds. Some of his men were rescued, others were not. The chalk mark he once made was gone to the sea, yet his battery's lesson lived on in the procedures written afterward. By 1945, proximity fuses were no longer experimental. They had become part of standard issue. Ammunition depots distributed crates marked under code numbers, with warnings about handling, but no longer limited to secrecy. What had begun as a handful of test rounds on Helena now filled magazines across fleets and armies. The numbers told the story. A staff briefing at the time reported that ships firing conventional time fuses required thousands of rounds to down a single attacker. With VT fuses, the kill rate rose several times over. One calculation put it in stark terms. 5-inch batteries with VT show 7-fold increase in effective rate of fire. The phrasing was clipped, but the meaning was decisive. Visual math showed it plainly. Before VT, defending ships might expend 1,000 shells for a single aircraft destroyed. After VT, that number dropped to a few hundred or less. Waste fell. Effect multiplied. 1,000 shells saved in a week meant 1,000 chances for another crew to survive. The impact showed not only in numbers, but in outcomes. At Okinawa, dozens of ships reported near misses instead of direct strikes. Pilots of kamikaze aircraft spoke after the war about bursts appearing suddenly in their path, explosions they could not outfly. What had once been predictable belts of fire became dense fields that met them at the merge point. European operations carried their own record. In 1944, Allied anti-aircraft gunners faced the German V-1 flying bomb, a weapon that moved too fast and too low for standard methods to stop. Early interception rates stood at barely a quarter. After VT fuses paired with radar predictors, success climbed to 2/3, then nearly 80%. For London, that difference meant thousands of homes still standing. Documents captured the transition. A wartime memorandum phrased it with understatement. Probability of intercept increased materially following fuse introduction. Behind that line lay the reality of fewer explosions in city streets, fewer casualties carried to improvised hospitals, and a population that could sleep without the same nightly dread. The Ardennes offered another chapter. Winter 1944 brought the first authorized use of VT in ground artillery against infantry formations. Shells no longer had to strike earth to cause effect. They burst overhead, scattering fragments across units in open ground. Casualty figures spiked sharply. Operational research teams logged the anomaly in December, ratios far above expected. Some officers celebrated, others hesitated. Voices inside Allied commands questioned whether such efficiency carried moral limits. The war pressed forward regardless. For Cochrane's legacy, the detail mattered less than the arc. What he and his men had done in early 1943 was to show that the fuse worked not as theory, but as practice. A chalk mark became a confirmation, a tally became policy, A single mount's results became training films and manuals distributed across theaters. The secrecy, once absolute, began to loosen after victories stacked. Training bulletins included step-by-step instructions on handling, setting, and logging proximity fuses. Commanders briefed their men on limitations: do not use near-friendly troops, recover all duds when possible, adjust timing for weather. What had been whispered as a field tweak turned into doctrine. The enemy continued to adapt. Japanese pilots varied height, sometimes coming in at sea level to reduce exposure. Germans attempted decoys and false tracers to confuse radar. But adaptation only slowed, never reversed the trend. Proximity fuses removed chance from the defender's side and forced the attacker into narrower margins. Supply officers noted another effect. Ammunition use declined even as effectiveness rose. Ships carried the same load but achieved more with it. Convoys to the Pacific saved space and fuel because fewer shells were needed for the same protective value. Logistics recorded what sailors felt instinctively. The weapon had changed the math of survival. The technology itself had required miracles of engineering. Miniature vacuum tubes built in guarded factories with tolerances so precise they barely survived assembly. Circuits sealed against shock that would shatter ordinary devices. Each fuse represented not only a weapon, but also a piece of industry compressed into inches. Engineers called it improbable. Sailors called it necessary. By war's end, evaluations from senior leaders reached the same verdict. Vannevar Bush, head of the wartime scientific effort, wrote plainly that, outside of the atomic bomb, no single innovation contributed more to victory than the proximity fuse. His line was quoted often in the years after. For Cochrane's generation, it felt less like praise and more like confirmation of what they had already seen in the heat of combat. In post-war years, archives filled with reports, graphs, and charts. They showed ratios of rounds per kill, reductions in wasted ammunition, and comparative curves of effect. Yet for the men who had stood on decks, the memory was not of graphs, but of noise, heat, and the knowledge that bursts now met targets instead of empty air. Helena never saw those later victories. She lay broken on the seafloor, another ship lost in a war that consumed steel as quickly as men. But the idea Cochrane carried lived on in fleets that followed. Every proximity burst fired in 1945 traced its lineage back to those first tests in combat, the night when a mount crew scratched chalk on a crate and trusted it enough to fire. One change had become system. One system had altered a war.